Hello, everyone. This is lecture number 5 that goes with chapter 8 in Hole's Essentials of Anatomy and Physiology. In this section, we're going to go over smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, as well as muscle actions. So smooth muscle cells, if you remember all the way back to one of the beginning chapters on histology, there's 3 different types of muscle tissue. So there's skeletal, which is what we've been talking about until now. There's smooth and there's cardiac. So you do need to remember the differences between them. So smooth muscle cells, they're much smaller in length than skeletal muscle cells. And they are not cylindrical. Instead, they're elongated and they have tapered in. So it's sort of like a candle flame, but on both ends. We actually call this spindle shaped, if you've ever seen a spindle before. They do not have striations. There's no striping. They look smooth, and hence the name smooth muscle. And because of their size, they don't really have a well-developed sarcoplasmic reticulum. It's not nearly as specialized as it is in the skeletal muscle cells. However, they do contain the thick and the thin filaments, the actin and the myosin, but they're arranged in a more random pattern. And this is because of the type of movement that smooth muscles do. They're not pulling all together to pull against a bone. Instead, they're pulling to move something through a hollow organ. So a good example of that is in your digestive system. The smooth muscle cells are pushing this food through your esophagus, stomach, and intestines. So there are a couple of types of the smooth muscle. If it's a multi-unit smooth muscle, which is found in your blood vessels and also in your eye, in the iris, which is the colored part. I know we haven't gone over eyes yet. The fibers, so the muscles themselves, muscle cells, occur separately instead of as in sheets. And these are stimulated by neurons, just like all of your other muscle cells. And then sometimes hormones can stimulate those too, which is why if you've ever been to the eye doctor and they dilate your eyes, the pupil part is controlled by your iris. The pupil is actually a hole. So they put drops of these hormones in your eyes, and that triggers the dilation. There's also visceral smooth muscle. So visceral is more like your traditional like organs that you would think of when you think of organs, so like the bigger organs. These occur in sheets, and it's found in the walls of your hollow organs. So this would be, like I just said, your esophagus, stomach, and intestines, amongst others. These fibers can stimulate each other and display rhythmicity. So what that means is as long as one muscle cell, muscle fiber gets the stimulus from a neuron, its contraction can stimulate all the other cells that it's touching to also contract, and they'll contract in unison, like as a rhythmic unit. And this is what causes a motion called peristalsis. So like when you swallow, especially if you've ever gotten something kind of stuck in your throat and you feel it slowly going down your throat, what you're feeling is the waves of peristalsis. So the smooth muscle, the visceral smooth muscle contracts together to push whatever's inside that hollow organ through it. Now, there are some similarities to how skeletal muscles contract because they both are using the thick and the thin filaments, the myosin and the actin. They're both stimulated by membrane impulses. So that section on how the neuron releases acetylcholine, and then that diffuses across the synaptic cleft until it hits the receptor protein, and that triggers calcium ions to be released. The same thing is happening here with the smooth muscles. However, the smooth muscle can use another neurotransmitter called norepinephrine. It's not just acetylcholine. So acetylcholine is the only thing that triggers skeletal muscle contraction. It triggers smooth muscle contraction as well, and then norepinephrine can inhibit smooth muscle contraction. So this norepinephrine is involved like in your fight or flight response. Your body releases that. and its cause is to transfer energy away from digestion. Like if you need to survive, like who cares if your food gets digested right now? It's not that important. So instead, your smooth muscle contractions are inhibited, and the energy that would have been used there is shunted, usually towards increasing your heart rate, your breathing rate, and sending blood to your legs so you can run away. So skeletal muscle doesn't have that inhibition, the stopping of the contraction. Skeletal muscle contractions only stop through the action of acetylcholinesterase, the enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine. So either acetylcholine is present or it's not present. But in smooth muscle, you have the acetylcholine or you have the norepinephrine. Now, smooth muscle is much slower to contract and relax, and that's because the filaments, the thick and the thin filaments, are not they're not regularly like built, like they're not in that same cylindrical pattern as the skeletal muscle, and the sarcoplasmic reticulum doesn't cover them because they're more random. It takes a little bit longer for them to stop the contraction or start it. Smooth muscle too can maintain a contraction longer using the same amount of ATP. And that has to do with the amount of force required is different. Like it takes a lot more muscle force to pull and move a whole bone or a whole part of the body rather than just to kind of smoosh food through your esophagus. And then smooth muscle can also change its length, but it doesn't change its tautness, how tight it is. So you kind of think of how smooth muscle contracts to be similar to like how a slug moves, if that'll help you picture it. All right, now cardiac muscle is only found in the heart. That's why it's called cardiac. It has branching cells and they're striated. So the striations, the stripes is similar to how the skeletal muscle cells are. The branching is unique to cardiac muscles. So cardiac muscles are much smaller in length. They only have one nucleus, same as the smooth muscle, but skeletal muscle has multiple nuclei. So these branching cardiac muscle cells actually interconnect with one another, and they make up these pretty complicated 3D networks. And they actually have a very special junction where they touch called an intercalated disc. I skipped down to the bottom there. Okay, so this is to allow the cells basically greater pulling power when they contract and to make it quicker and easier to communicate. From cell to cell, but all cardiac muscle cells, they touch one another. And they're branching because the heart is, we'll get more into the heart when we get to the cardiovascular system, but the heart, it's not just a hollow tube that has to squeeze something through it. It's actually a fairly complex pump, and it has 4 different chambers, and there's 2 upper and 2 lower, and there's left and right side. And when your heart beats, it actually has a double contraction, and that's why you have a lub-dub sound. And it kind of contracts almost in a circular motion, I guess. So the network for contraction, it's more complex. So again, the sarcoplasmic reticulum here is not as well developed as in the skeletal muscles, and the heart doesn't store as much calcium as the skeletal muscle does. The T tubules do supply extra calcium from extracellular fluid. So a cardiac muscle cell twitch will last longer. So that basically allows the heart to pump with more force as compared to the skeletal muscle fiber. Cardiac muscle is self-exciting and rhythmic. So what that means, self-exciting, it means the cardiac muscle will contract all on its own. Like if you had a cardiac muscle cell in a petri dish and it had enough nutrients, it will contract. So you could actually see it under a microscope beating, basically. Now it does receive messages from our nervous system. There are neurons that connect to it, and those control how fast or how slow your heart rate is, how quickly or how slowly your heart beats. But the heart muscle itself, the cardiac muscle itself, can beat all on its own, and it's rhythmic, just like the smooth muscle. So where one cardiac muscle touches another, they will beat in unison. So if you had two cardiac muscle cells in a petri dish, and they're beating separately with separate rhythms, if you scooch them together and they form an intercalated disc, they'll start beating in unison. Just actually just really cool how that works. Okay. And here you go. Here's a nice breakdown of where you can find the different types of muscle tissue and their functions and how they're different. This is also in your textbook if you would like to use it for study. Now, moving on, we're going to talk just about skeletal muscle action. So back to skeletal muscles, and we're talking about like a muscle as an organ on the whole, like what is it doing? So skeletal muscles, even though they contract, they must work together with the skeleton, the bones, in order to move your body. So if a skeletal muscle becomes detached from the bone, even if it contracts, nothing will happen. Like if you had an injury on your Achilles tendon that broke off, your calf muscles, you wouldn't be able to walk. You couldn't pick up your foot. That's because the bones act as levers for movement. So the skeletal muscle will contract and it will pull on the lever of your bone. It's attached to a different bone usually, and that's what provides the motion. So on the next slide, you'll see a picture of the elbow joint and the arm, okay, as an example. So for a lever has to have certain parts. Has to have a rigid bar or a rod, so your forearm bones in this case. Has to have a fulcrum or a pivot. So this would be where your elbow joint is. So that's the point where the bar is going to turn. Has to have an object that is moved against resistance. So in this instance, it's your hand. And it needs a force supplying energy for movement, and that force is coming from your arm muscles. Okay. Look here on the picture, you can see, so here's the fulcrum, here's the muscle that's going to provide the force. There's this is your triceps, that's relaxed, but your bicep is providing the force. And it's going to get shorter and it will pull here and move the hand. Okay, now to bend this the other way, sorry, didn't have the laser pointer on. So here's the fulcrum, and then here the biceps is the contracting muscle that will pull the hand forward. So it'll decrease this angle here and flex your arm. But to pull it back the other way, the hand, you can't just relax the bicep, okay? Instead, what you have to have is an opposing muscle group that contracts. So in this case, the triceps, that's gonna, see it has an insertion here and it's gonna pull the arm and the hand back. Okay. Oops, I went the wrong way. Now, each muscle has an origin and it has an insertion. So the origin is the part that basically does not move. It might move a little bit, but that's the stable side. The insertion is the part that's the moving side. So one side stays still, it's braced, the other side is doing the movement. So muscle contraction, when it happens, will pull the side of the insertion towards the origin. Now, some muscles can have more than one of these, either or, like the biceps has 2 heads and the triceps has 3 heads. That's what sep means head, and bi means 2. So the biceps has two origins. Both of the heads attach to portions of the scapula, in this case for the biceps, and the insertion is on the radius. And then the muscle is located on the anterior surface of your humerus. And that's the typical muscle we think of when someone says, you know, to a little kid, like, oh, make a muscle. Well, it's the biceps is what you're talking about, you know, or if you like, you want to show off your guns, whatever, that's your biceps. When the biceps contract, that action is called flexion. We'll talk about muscle movements a little bit later on. So here you go. So here are the two heads, okay? But see, they come together for one insertion. So two origins. So one is, these are tendons here. So one is attached here to the scapula and the other is attached here to the scapula. And then the insertion is down here on your radius, okay? And when you flex this biceps, it's gonna pull against this bone and pull the whole arm up. If you were to ever dislocate your shoulder here, it's going to be quite painful and you're going to have issues because of where these origins are. You're going to have issues moving your arm up. It's going to be quite painful. You're going to stretch and pull these tendons. They're going to be injured along with all the ligaments that hold your humerus and your scapulae together, which are not pictured here. Okay, so here are some common muscle movements, and these go along with the movements we learned back with joints. The flexion decreases the angle between bones at a joint. So when you contract your biceps, you are flexing because you're decreasing the angle at the elbow. But if you flex your triceps, you're extending because you're increasing the angle at the elbow. Skeletal muscles, we usually categorize them into groups. So one muscle is going to cause an action and it's going to do the majority of the work, and it's called the prime mover. I prefer prime mover to agonist just because it's easier to remember, but they're both valid vocabulary words. So that's the main muscle. However, there are some muscles that assist the prime mover in that major movement, and these are called synergists. They work together, together. Then other muscles that oppose that action are called antagonists. So in our example of if we want to flex the arm, then the bicep is the prime mover, the tricep would be the antagonist. These are relational. So if we were talking about extending the arm, well, then in that case, the triceps would be the prime mover and the biceps would be the antagonist. So pay attention to which movement is being discussed. Okay, and that is the end of this section of the notes.